quick note before the show. I did get a message from Alicia that I promised I would pass along. In the course of the conversation, we briefly talk about a scene from Pride and Prejudice, and she was very scrupulous about, not wanting to make mistakes. She said, "I am somewhat mortified to realize that I got Pemberley's situation wrong. Of course, it is in Derbyshire. Don't know if there is a way to edit my Yorkshire comment." I think she suggested it was in Yorkshire, though even at the moment she expressed doubt about this. She said, "Austenites will have me for lunch, rightly so." I don't think anyone will have her for lunch, but I do hope you enjoy our conversation. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. So I'm speaking this week with A.E. Stallings, a poet who truly doesn't need an introduction, especially if you've listened to this podcast at all. She's the current Oxford Professor of Poetry, and her most recent book is This Afterlife, which is a selected poems. She's written plenty of other books. She's also a very good translator of Greek and Latin. But I don't do big introductions on this show, and I'm not going to do one for her. I will just say that I have never been so nervous to interview someone. I don't usually get that nervous about interviews. I was kind of a wreck for this one, and it does come across. I actually had a great deal of technical trouble saving the audio for this. I spent about 5 hours immediately after talking to her just working not to lose the audio. So the quality, particularly of my recording, is not great, but I don't think it's bad at all. I'm not in my best form, to be honest, because there is a story about Richard Feynman, the famous physicist. And apparently, just a regular occurrence was that people would bring to him new research they had done in advanced physics that they had prepared for publication. And when they brought it to him to check on it, to get a second look, to see if they'd made any small errors that needed adjusting, he would apparently very frequently reach into a drawer that he kept behind his desk, pull out a paper on exactly the same subject, and say, "Yes, I noticed that a few years ago. I just didn't think it was worth publishing." So that story, I think, conveys pretty accurately how I feel about not only every poem I've ever written, but like every thought I have about poetry. When talking to Alicia, she is exceedingly polite and generous and sweet-natured and funny. I mean, she's in addition to being a MacArthur genius, she's a Southern girl. She was quite wonderful. We talked about Rachel Wetzsteon, a New York poet who was the same age as Stallings, just about, published 3 books of poetry and a book of criticism, a study of Auden, before she died in 2009. She killed herself, and then a final book came out after that. In the conversation, Alicia suggests that there may have been another book following Silver Roses, which was her posthumous collection. I have not been able to find it, if it does exist. So I think she only has the 4 books, Silver Roses being the last one. We talk about her poems. Stallings knew her a little bit, but not much. And so we really just focus on the poetry. I've enjoyed her poetry. I discovered it by way of Stallings' review of her last collection, and I've admired it since then. So I was glad to get someone on who could talk about it more learnedly than I could. Wetzsteon herself was very learned, and I think Stallings was a good a good match for her. We also talk a little bit about the business of being the Oxford Professor of Poetry and Stallings' own work. But mostly we talk about Wetzsteon. This did end up being a double episode. I didn't realize we had talked as long as we did. But despite my own subpar performance, I think you will very much enjoy hearing from A. Stallings. You're in Greece for now. In between, I know I can't ever keep up with how Oxford breaks up its year. I know Cameron explained it to me once, but it's very complicated.
Yeah, it is very complicated. I think their autumn term, which is known as Michaelmas, has just started this past week.
Okay. Do you for the most part stay in Athens during the year, or do you stay up there some? I know you give the lectures there, but
Well, I try to be kind of present for some chunks of time during the terms. I mean, I sort of campaigned on being accessible and being there. It is a little complicated because the position doesn't say come with a particular set of rooms or a desk or a locker or anything like that.
right. Welcome, figure it out.
That's my only complaint. I mean, they will find a place to put me up, but I mean, it's a little bit nomadic, and there's nowhere to leave a pair of wellies or an academic gown. So
Right.
I'm constantly lobbying for like the Oxford Professor of Poetry locker. That's what I
Yeah.
want.
The position basically is giving the lectures, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think that's the main requirement is to give a lecture a term, although one is also encouraged to do something else like a reading or a workshop. And as I've said, I've kind of tried to be as present as possible when
Sure.
I'm there. So I've done, some open office hours and, where I'll look at people's poems and I try to show up at student things and just generally be part of the life of
Want,
the university when I'm
want the
there. I'm going to
grounds.
be there next week, so I'll be there for about a week, and then I'll be back around American Thanksgiving for the next lecture.
Okay. Well, yeah, I look forward to. I've enjoyed the ones I've listened to. You have three up so far. That's because
Yep, there's one a term, and so I've done my first year,
all right.
and so there'll be 3 this year, and the whole thing is 4 years. So
All
at
right.
the end, there should be 12.
Yeah, I have only really kept up with the most recent three, I guess. Armitage and well, there's Armitage and Oswald, and then was before Armitage, was that Hill, or was he a ways earlier? I can't remember.
I think it might have been Hill before Armitage. Is that right?
Um,
No, maybe Hill is one before. Gosh, I should know this. I'm blanking on it.
sure, yeah, but yeah, yeah, it's there. I've been interested in the form because it feels like a sort of a curious form for a composition. It's not like a scholarly lecture, and it's not like a close reading, but it's sort of like a readerly path through some poems and through it seems like the Armitages of the four of y'all are seems to be the most like straightforwardly instructive, but with as different as you and Hill and Oswald are, they do seem to have this sort of odd. I mean, maybe that's like an Oxfordian or a UK sort of lecture style, but I find it interesting, but it's not quite like other things I've encountered elsewhere.
I think they can be whatever kind of you want to be. I think the only thing they cannot be is a reading of your own
Sure.
work,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they cannot be in verse. That was put in, I think Paul
Oh,
Moult did one of his in verse, and that's now in the fine print also. Although, I mean, I think it could be delightful to do one in verse, but it's it. I think they can be different things. They could be more of a craft talk or more of a you don't have to be a poet to be the Oxford Professor of Poetry. Christopher Ricks, was
sure.
this amazing critic. So you can do different kinds of things. I think when I attended one of Seamus Heaney's, it was just a very excellent close reading of Hero and Leander.
Okay.
I think people can do different things, and I'm kind of trying to try different tacks myself. This next one will be, I guess, a little bit more of a craft talk, and others have been, things that the hobby horses of mine, I guess, things that I'm interested in, and you kind of want to make use of things that you're already researching and talking about, so not everything has to be manufactured out of from scratch.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I mean, I think it's a kind of interesting thing because they're open to the public. So it's not really, like if you were at a poetry conference and doing a craft talk, you would make some assumptions about what your audience knows or not. And this is also, on the one hand, you're going to have people who are enormously more expert in whatever you're talking about than you are
yeah,
yourself, but there will also be people who know nothing about what you're talking about. So there's know nothing about contemporary American poetry or about meter or about Byron or whatever. So it's a kind of strange thing that you're walking, where you want to be accessible to the audience and want to have interesting things to say. I don't know if I've been entirely successful with this, but you have to kind of assume that anybody from any discipline or not from the university might be in that audience.
yeah. I know. I tend to think that puts probably a mostly helpful pressure on. I mean, maybe not helpful, but like healthy pressure on that kind of writing. But so I know I look forward to the rest of them. But oh, and then Chris mentioned that I have not looked at it, but he just the other day pointed out that you've been doing these blog posts on individual poems. I'll have to take a look at it. You just did one on one of Penelope's, I think, which is a
Yes,
terrific
I mean,
book.
this is new. This is a new thing. Again, I'm kind of trying to be a good professor of poetry, but this idea that, maybe every couple of weeks, I hope I can keep that up. I'll just take a kind of newish poem from a new book or a journal that I really like and just talk about it a little. It's kind of one of these ways to get poetry, contemporary poetry, into the larger conversation. Maybe get some attention to books that might not otherwise, there are many ways of doing, I guess, this kind of literary citizenship. You can write blurbs or book reviews or whatever, but I thought this was a unique platform that I could use just to talk about poems that I liked.
And there's less diplomatic rounding off than with a review of an entire book. You just say, like, here's this one poem, and let me just not worry about making a larger statement.
That is true. That is
Yeah.
always good. I mean, I'm more interested, to be honest, in individual poems than in books of poems.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think books are a very temporary unit of poetry. But that is, by the way, the Paulson book is a one I've been interested in because it's so focused on sound, but unlike a lot of books focused on sound, I still find it to be like a credible. It's not a conversational voice, but it's like a credible human voice, which sometimes my attention drifts in poetry that's so intent on sort of play with sound, but with her, she keeps my attention.
Yeah, I actually have a theory that most poets have a kind of attention difference. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
There's kind of poet brain, and yes, there's certain kinds of very focused attention, and then also very short kinds of attention that poets are prone to.
Yeah, mine is not. I would say I'm not sure what the strengths of mine are, but I know what some of the weaknesses are. But I asked you, and you were very generous in agreeing to talk some about Rachel. What I only was reading yesterday that it's pronounced Wetzsteon.
That is how I pronounce it. Yes.
Okay, all right, good. I am stubbornly phonetic in most of my pronunciation, so but I'll try to stick to Wetzsteon. Rachel Wetzsteon, who was a contemporary of yours, sort of close.
Yeah, I think she was like 1 year older than I am. Yeah. So definitely contemporary.
Um,
Coevals.
and I learned of her through your review of her last book. That was my
Right. That was a while ago.
Beautiful Fierce Cheats was what you called it, which is from her description of mirrors in Silver Rose.
Right. That must have been from the Wyman era of poetry.
Yeah, I believe so.
Right.
Yeah,
The golden years.
yeah, I kind of think so. I've been looking at some of what yeah, I you know, I feel like it takes a while to get seasoned in as an editor, so I'm kind of hopeful for Mataika,
Yeah.
but I would love to see more of his personal taste. I'd love to see just sort of like, all right, what are you into?
Yeah, I
um,
agree.
but I mean, it was a compelling review. It was a double review of that and a book by Beth Bachman that I had not otherwise heard of, called Temper, that made I think a splash at the time, which was and you, I thought, in a very diplomatic uh, and complimentary way, I mean, I guess in both senses complimentary, you set these two books next to each other, not against each other, but you did identify maybe some points of comparison and contrast. That the Bachman book was largely the story of a real terrible event that had happened in the life of somebody close to her. This was a, you know, you talk about the maybe a difference between truth and authenticity.
Yes, I think the Bachman book involved the murder of her sister. Is that correct? Does
I
that
think
sound
that's right. Yeah, I knew it was a family member.
Um, so certainly there's this very large event in the context of the book. I don't think I selected those two books. I think I was assigned those two books. So had to kind of find a way to talk about the two of them. That's my memory of it, which could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean and it's hard to know, particularly because with reviews, there is a lot of there's often a lot of flattery and there's diplomacy. There's also sort of, at least I got used to reading, or maybe sometimes incorrectly reading into reviews, some, you know, subtle pressures and statements, and I thought that you were nothing but generous to both poets, but you did sort of raise, I think, some questions about, you know, maybe some of the respective strengths and weaknesses. That part of what gave you said of the Bachman book, does it make the poems more terrifying or less that they are based in fact? Would this book be diminished if it were based on fiction? Yes, but why? What does it
That's a
mean that?
general thing that I'm always interested in. I think that
Yeah,
this idea of, is it important? Is the factual background of this poem important? And if so, why? And what does that mean? I mean, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, but I think in that case, certainly it was part of the attention of the book, and certainly some of the power of the book obviously comes from the actual suffering, but but as readers, we're going to read the poems differently if we think this is an actual thing that occurred as opposed to not. So I was kind of most interested in poems that I thought could hold up to their being fictive, if that makes
yeah,
any sense. Because to me, that means
yeah.
that they're stronger. I don't know. That's a kind of odd thing to say, but I have been thinking about that. I mean, when we think about like John Crow Ransom's Bells for John
Right.
Whitside's Daughter, which is one of the most devastating poems I know and one of my favorite poems, and it's entirely fictive. So
Oh, is it? I didn't know
it's
that.
not based on anything.
I didn't know that. All right.
I mean,
Uh,
I mean, it may be that,
yeah,
he's
yeah.
known children who have
The
died
geese
and
is
so
that he just
on.
made up. He just made up the thing about the geese and the. Oh, wow. All right.
I
That's
mean, I don't know. There may be things that are not made up in there,
sure,
but I'm
sure. Yeah,
saying that this is not based on the death of a friend named John Woodside. I mean, so
yeah,
then you think, my God,
yeah, yeah. No, but
what does this
I
mean?
mean, in addition to being a beautiful and shapely elegy, part of what appeals about it is that it has the weirdness, the weird specificity of real life. That feel,
Yes.
the aside from knowing anything about the biography, it has that, sort of strange, like, oh, that is such a weird little childish thing. But you, I mean, I think you smartly point out that it is possible, of course, for the historical, I think of it as the really having happenedness of a poem to give it emotional power. But then and you bring up Dorothy Parker's famous little poem, Resume, which is sort of a dark tongue-in-cheek poem about different ways to kill yourself. And you said, would we read this verse differently if Parker had actually killed herself? You said it would give a true poem the redundant whiff of authenticity. The poem already rings true, but if she had killed herself and then we read this poem, it would affect the way we read it, adding something to it, but maybe not for the good. It might make us underappreciate what's already true about the poem.
Yeah, I mean, I stand by that. It's kind of strange to read this review that I wrote like a decade or more ago.
I know. I'm going back to you thinking.
I stand by most of it. I mean, I don't know always what was going through my mind at the time.
Sure,
but, I mean, I just remember, being a very Generation X person and, being in college in Athens, Georgia at a certain time of hipness in the air, listening to endless arguments about Joy Division versus the Smiths or whatever, and like Joy Division would win because he had actually killed himself and not just talked to that kind of that
very
kind
sad.
of
That seems like it shouldn't be the deciding
teenage
factor.
conversation that people have, but then it's very different, I think, to be a poet and know a poet, somewhat socially and personally, and then to be shocked at this terrible act that they commit. And it's I guess one thing to talk about these things in a kind of theoretical thing, but I do just remember how utterly shocked everyone was and how devastating it was when we did get the news about Rachel Wetzsteon. And and so it was strange to be reviewing this book in the fairly recent wake of the news and to suddenly realize this is definitely somebody's last book. Well, I mean, there might be other poems there. In fact, there is another book, I believe, but that work has been kind of rounded off, and realizing things start to have different meanings based on how that life has concluded. Kind of feeling really bad that one didn't know more about her work, when I could have talked to her about it and so on. I mean, we met occasionally, but we weren't particularly close. I don't think I had a correspondence with her.
Sure.
But we had lots of friends in common, and yeah, it definitely sent shockwaves around for quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I would be lying if I said that was not part of what left an impression. Hearing about her and then reading your review and reading. I read the last book first. So it certainly.
I think there's a book that came out after of further posthumous work, but
I didn't know that.
The only two books I have actually are Silver Roses and Sakura Park that are here. I might have others, but I haven't been able to track them down.
And and that is in talking to other people who were, so we should say she was I think lifelong New York City poet. I know her poetry seems
she's sort of very much of the city, born and grew up there, and it's very much one of the themes of her work. So
I mean, Sakura Park is a park in Morningside Heights, I think.
Right. Yeah, there should be some kind of monument, actually.
Yeah, I'm going to be there in
nice to have a
February, and I was thinking
maybe there is
actually go visit. And it is in talking to people who knew her work. So and she did kill herself in 2009, and then this last book, Silver Roses, or last, or maybe as you said, there may be one more, came out a couple of years after that. It does seem to be, when I talk to poets who were familiar with her work earlier, it feels like Silver Roses has what I think of as like a Stankonia problem. Do you know I don't know if you know the Atlanta hip hop group Outkast, but they made a big splash when I was in college with an album called Stankonia, which was a great album and had a lot of hits, but anybody who was a fan would sort of downplay that album to praise the previous ones. And, in part it seemed to demonstrate the kind of the authenticity of their appreciations. And I think Sakura Park is a really strong book, but it feels like when I've spoken to people about her work, they often say, "Oh, well, forget Silver Roses, read Sakura Park." But Silver Roses is quite a strong book in its own right, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, there's terrific work in both books. She has different modes. I mean, there's
Yeah.
certainly a fair amount of, light verse and so forth. And I think
You
that can
coined
make
the
it,
term Swart verse, which seems to me pretty apt in her.
yeah, that kind of really dark light verse that's like
Yeah.
Dorothy Parker-esque or A.E. Housman-esque, maybe even. Yeah, she's got a lot of that. There's a lot of this wry, very, very dark humor. And I think generally in any poet's work, if there's a certain amount of that, it can be harder for their reputation to peek through because people get a little bit distracted by the fact that the person has wit and a sense of humor.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's one of these things that critics place a very high premium on. I think readers do,
Yeah.
I think some of the poems like you sent me, like the After Wyatt,
Yeah.
is hilarious and
Yeah.
and fun and literary and dark. But I think it can be easy for people to, they want something that's heavier and less leavened with wit. And I think one of the things
Something you could read at a funeral, maybe.
maybe, oh dear. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the other thing that's, I think, maybe can make it harder for her reputation to kind of, well, she's not around right now to promote it all the time. There's that. And she certainly obviously would have written other amazing books and a strong body of work, I think we're left without because of her untimely death, I would say. But she's such a reader, and so many of the poems are about other books or other kinds of works of art, and really kind of require a certain amount of literacy, I think, on the part of the reader. And maybe we're not used to that either. I mean, I think one of the things that's extraordinary is the number of poems that are about novels and about characters in novels. I mean, there's also like the subset of poems that are about movies and pop culture of a certain kind of rarefied kind. I'm trying to think of other poets who are really successful at this. I mean, it's one thing to write a persona poem about, a mythological figure or a biblical figure. But I mean, I could not write, I don't think, a poem from the point of view of a character in a novel and not have it be kind of an exercise or,
Right.
I mean, I've kind of tried a little bit with Alice of Alice in Wonderland, but I think she might be more mythological, really, even though she comes
the way you treat her, I think. Going back and like reading those books with my daughter, they're wonderful, but I realized like my sense of Alice had been altered through larger cultural discussion as well as through your poems. They're like, oh, there's a lot of stuff that's not actually here in the original book.
Where she's got, I mean, I think Septimus is one of her
Yeah,
very
from Mrs.
poems,
Dalloway. And in fact, the poem you mentioned, just because I think there are some people, she's come up on the podcast before, but I think there's some people who might not know her work. So I might, since it's real short, I might quickly read the little freely from Wyatt. And then I would love if you'd read the poem you mentioned, Pemberly, which is another one I realized I don't know enough to appreciate adequately. This is briefly freely from Wyatt, and you do mention, I think, in your review that whereas Bachman is careful to identify even a single line that she lifts from Yeats, Wetzsteon doesn't contextualize anything, but sort of assumes familiarity with a pretty big variety. I mean, not just a large number, but a variety of works, old, new, serious, light, and otherwise. This is freely from Wyatt with, of course, a lot of nods to "They flee from me that sometime did me seek." I have become the forlorn type who buys almond biscotti for a long night in, glumly recapturing a sense of sin through stomach aches. It hath been otherwise. How many times encountering a line I like, I long to cry, "How like you this?" But my enjoyments are no longer his, any more than his delights are mine. Busily seeking with continual change, lacking a chamber, naked, meek, and sore of foot, feel free to show up at my door. I'll find a shawl. I will not think it strange. And apart from just being a nicely turned little piece of verse and a kind of a fun rehearsal of a wonderful poem, also one that I think like the Wyatt poem in particular is so much stronger in the like the first part than in the ending of that poem always feels weird. So I kind of appreciate that she's put a bow on it rather nicely here. But I do think that in a slightly more serious way, she's found there is something in romance that is fundamentally farcical from the outside, that it can be the most deadly serious thing in the world to you, but as the Greeks knew well, to everybody else you look like an absolute fool. And she's found a way to bring in lofty language with a kind of a knowing smile, that it can be both serious and goofy at once, which I think to me just feels like it's appropriate to the subject matter.
Yeah, and I think it's wonderful that you can, have the almond biscotti and half in the same poem. And, she
Yeah.
does that through quotation, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like that. I mean, there's a way that the poem feels of a piece, even with all of this wonderful quotation that's going on in it. I like that it's not a sonnet. She's kind of resisted that.
Yeah, and it's
But
presented as sort of three separate stanzas.
and there may be more things going on there, including with the name Wyatt. I don't know, but
I always assume there's something I'm not getting.
yeah, but I think you're left feeling quite vulnerable from the poem. I think that's one of the things that happens is she comes out and this very self-deprecating, I'm one of those people that just is getting a stomach ache from this almond biscotti. But at the end, you kind of are one with her and you feel like your heart's been ripped open.
Right.
And I would not find it strange that maybe that negative at the end, and I'm very much a fan of counterfactuals and negatives. Anne Carson writes about that it's a way of keeping both things, in play at once.
Yeah.
So it's one of these very light seeming poems because it's tossed off with such sprezzatura and lightness, and that you read it and you reread it and you reread it, and it just it always kind of makes you want to cry.
No, absolutely. There's I was talking to Ryan last night. There's a habit, I think, that a lot of contemporary formal poets have of including words or phrases that nicely fit the form of the poem, but that feel in terms of voice a little off, or as he says, that you can't read them without winking or wincing. And I think with her, she manages to achieve sort of the opposite effect, which is she puts in what are obvious quotations or obvious speeches out of context, but she by acknowledging that they're out of place, she allows them actually to be sincere as well. This is sort of, you can hear her. This is the way that it's somebody who likes books will will throw in a quotation knowingly and in a self-mocking way, but also at the same time mean it.
Yeah, and I think there's also this sense that, when you're reading a poem like this, if you are fans of poetry the way you are or the way I am, and of certain kinds of poems particularly, we know we are the audience. We are the audience for that poem. We don't want a footnote on that, by God.
Right. Oh God, no. Yeah.
That would just be insulting.
Yeah. There's a line in another poem where she talks about flirting with a guy by using lines from Keats, and the first line of the poem is, "Yes, I know what it's from, and so do you."
Yeah, fine.
There's no
Exactly.
need. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes you do get I'm looking at notes, like there are two notes at the back of at Silver Roses,
Oh, are there?
which was, letter from a leprosarium as a response to my poem, A Leper in the City. And then she says maypoles for the phrase gorse girl. I'm indebted to the poet Eva Saltzman and Sarah Hannah's own poem, You Furs Me Gorse. Things that we really would not know. She's like,
Yeah,
okay, these
yeah,
things I will tell you. But, she expects us to be the kind of friends who are into the things that she is into. And,
yeah, yeah.
that's a
These
that's a
refer to things
balm.
that are not in the larger public. I mean, they're in the public record, but they're not in the larger landscape of literature or literature or culture that you could be expected to know.
Right.
Yeah. So you mentioned that your favorite poem of hers is Pemberley from Sakura Park, and it's one I remember reading it and finding the voice of it very recognizable and persuasive, but I don't think I had enough context to appreciate it. I still don't. I realize the title is from an estate in, is it Pride and Prejudice?
Yes. So any Jane Austen fan will be immediately aware of what we're talking about. Whether it's Jane Austen or even, the famous BBC 1991, Pride and Prejudice, if you are fans of either of those, Pemberley is the amazing estate in Yorkshire that Darcy has. And basically, Elizabeth Lizzie Bennet has not fully understood how rich he really is until she sees this estate.
Okay.
I mean, it's not that she's not already in love with him or whatever, but this kind of drives home like, oh my God, I turned this down. This is insane.
Okay. Oh,
I
so this
it's
is after she's rejected him. All right. I
Yeah,
have
they've
not
had all
read the
these
book,
kinds
so
of,
yeah, I don't know.
yeah, I'm sorry, it's a spoiler. It has a
No.
happy ending. But yeah, so basically she's been flirting with him. He's proposed to her, but in an insulting way. She's rejected him. They're kind of on the outs. And it's sort of just by chance that her aunt and uncle drive her to Yorkshire, and is it Yorkshire? Maybe that's not right. I could have that wrong. Someone's gonna correct me. And they see this amazing house. And when this poem appeared in The Nation, there were three lines. The three lines, the park was very large. We drove for some time through a beautiful wood until the wood ceased and the house came into view, is also given as an epigraph, as if it is a quotation from the novel. But then I went and
It's sort of
looked
a
at it.
paraphrase from the novel. Like I looked at the passage, it's
It's a
like, yeah,
paraphrase because, of course, Elizabeth isn't saying this in the first person.
right.
This is not a first. But it's interesting because in the version of the poem in The Nation, there's this kind of sleight of hand that looks like it's directly
Uh,
from the novel when it's not. And then I went and looked at the novel at the chapter, whatever. This Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the appearance of Pemberley Woods with some perturbation, and when at length they turned in at the lodge, her spirits were in a high flutter. The park was very large and contained a great variety of ground. They entered it at one of the lowest points and drove for some time through a beautiful wood stretching over a wide extent. So there's already something kind of interesting going on in the way it appears to quote, but it's not really quoting.
it's a
Um,
favorite trick of Borges is like reverse plagiarism, where you make something up in a tribute to somebody you like.
it's something going on like that, because so it feels as if it starts with a direct quotation, but it's not a direct quotation, although almost every detail is taken directly from the book. Pemberley. The park was very large. We drove for some time through a beautiful wood until the wood ceased and the house came into view. Inside were miniatures, small faces we gawked at until the housekeeper showed us the master's finer portrait in an upper room. I dredged up a shaming moment. You asked me a question, then ducked as I spewed an idiot's vitriol, blindness disguised as rage. The house stood well on rising ground, and beneath its slopes, the thirsty couples held their glasses high at Cafe Can't Wait. I spent time at its flimsy tables, but then I walked under trees whose leaves exhaled gusty stories of good deeds. I learned empty houses are excellent teachers. I sent you away and felt you grow tremendous in your absence. Ask me again.
The last two sentences are quite wonderful. And they, even without knowing the novel, they feel it's a recognizable sentiment. I sent you away and felt you grow tremendous in your absence. Ask me again. So
And I
having
think,
read, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, good.
For me, this isn't, especially with your commentary, this is an introduction to the scene itself, to the events in the novel itself, which are, which are compelling. I'm curious for you, as somebody who's already read and loved the book, what does this bring to it that is new? As you said, you would find it hard to write a poem about a novel that wasn't an exercise. So what does this do you think?
I think it's the poet speaking and not Elizabeth Bennet. It's taking this almost mythological trope of romance literature out of Pride and Prejudice. I mean, it's not the voice of Elizabeth Bennet in a way. It feels like the voice of Rachel Wetzsteon. And so there's this strange ventriloquism that is happening. Elizabeth Bennet we think of as being, very clever, very sharp, but she's not this kind of screwball heroine. I think she was played by Katharine Hepburn, but that's not maybe the ideal casting. Just the fact that it is at once adhering very closely to the novel, except for the Cafe Can't Wait. Obviously, maybe this stands in for the, Taverna Inn where she and her aunt and uncle are staying. I forget the name of the whatever arms or whatever. This is clearly, even with the name Cafe Can't Wait, we're clearly being metaphorical. This is clearly not out of Jane Austen or Pride and Prejudice. And there's something about, I have spent time at its flimsy tables where you realize, again, something else is going on. We've all spent time at the flimsy tables of Cafe Can't Wait. And I think the simple word choices, Eudora Welty has talked about how in Jane Austen, there's next to no description. There's like nothing. A room in a house is well proportioned. The features of a beautiful girl are, regular. I mean, it's just
honestly, I need to read more. I need to read her because that sounds like my kind of right. The descriptions are always what I tend to my eyes glaze over at. So
there are no descriptions. I mean, it's like a beautiful wood or whatever. And somehow I think Wetzsteon kind of manages to get this exactly. I spent time at its flimsy tables, but then I walked under trees whose leaves exhaled gusty stories of good deeds. I love the gusty stories of the leaves. I can feel this almost might even be from the BBC production and not from the book. I can feel kind of Elizabeth Bennet walking under these trees or Rachel Wetzsteon walking under trees. And wind is blowing through the trees. That idea of like, go out and touch grass. That idea, hey, maybe you need to be a little bit more in touch with your emotions, and being in this place is helping you. But also that gusty stories of good deeds, which sounds a little bit like, ancient stories of daring do. There's something about the vowel music that's going on and about some of the alliteration, about the sort of almost rhyme with leaves, that assonance, the exhaling gusty stories of good deeds. This idea of like, I've been so up in my head and I haven't paid attention to, the wonderful qualities of this person who is absent. I learned empty houses are excellent teachers. I mean, I love that also. I sent you away and felt you grow tremendously. Ask me again. And of course, we know in the book, he does ask her again. And this results, in that catastrophic happy ending, that romance novels pull out of the hat.
Yeah. But
Um,
that makes this poignant in a different way. If, as you said, it's the suggestion is that this is the poet speaking. That we don't. Lizzie Bennet doesn't need to ask him to ask again because we know he will. But this is something else.
yeah, and I think that's also what does make it very poignant is the speaker of this poem is not guaranteed this happy ending.
Right.
Whether it is Elizabeth Bennet who doesn't know what's going to happen because that's,
Sure.
chapters and chapters away, or it's the speaker of the poem who is not quite Elizabeth Bennet. And I just think it's a very neat trick. And it's also one of these poems that always kind of blows my heart open at the end. I just,
Yeah.
there's just this breathless anticipation for the answer of this question that we just don't know. And
Yeah.
it's not efficient just titling it Pemberly. There's no reference to Pride and Prejudice. I just appreciate the lack of condescension.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, yeah, yeah. Which is a constant. It's also, I mean, for somebody who has the ability to be very dazzling with form, this is a poem that does not flex those muscles. I mean, I do find that because she wrote in such a variety of forms, including sort of classical or pseudo classical measures, where I know there are poems that sort of either the syllabics work out to be alcaics or they're sapphics, or they're even not exactly, the stresses don't quite follow the pattern of sapphics, but they are all generally falling, or there's a variety of forms that she takes on, and some of them are purely syllabics, but then she also writes in free verse. And so the result can be that there's a sense that all of the lines are shaped with care, even though it's not always immediately clear to the ear what, if any, formal choices are being made. And this is a poem in which there may be form I have not yet picked up on, but it seems very much to be understated free verse, which is, unless, you tell me.
No, I think that's right. I mean, tremendous in your absence, ask me again starts to be kind of iambic pentameter, but the park was very large. We drove, it is what it is. If I may use that as a metrical term.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would just say that this is a kind of sturdy, free verse. It isn't even quite blank verse. It is truly, I think, kind of a free verse.
Yeah.
But yeah, she does have this wonderful facility with meters and so forth. I guess John Hollander was maybe one of her teachers, so that would explain the alcaics. He was obsessed with alcaics. Like Septimus, this wonderful poem about this suicidal character from Mrs. Dalloway is in wonderful syllabics. I don't know if I've scanned it through and seen the extent to which the stresses match up with classical stresses, but it's extremely close, if nothing else. But I think also, since I did mostly meet her at places like Westchester, maybe exclusively at places like Westchester, poetry conference, which was very skewed towards certain kinds of formalism. I mean, there were a lot of people maybe that's not a correct characterization, but where there was a lot of a certain kind of formalism. And I think for me, it was refreshing and exciting to have someone who is, willing to play with all the different kinds of forms, whether it's syllabics or free verse or any of these other things. And also just kind of had because she really came from a more academic background. I mean, she had written about Auden and his influences and so forth, was somewhat outside of that kind of poetry world and bringing in, I think, more possibilities where, in some cases the possibilities seem to be narrowing. She was always throwing that open, I think.
I am curious because it's just despite my writing at this point pretty much only in meter, and a lot of the people I speak to being metrically habitually metrical poets, the new formalists have become sort of a strange punching bag on this podcast, largely thanks to Cameron, who's has a belligerent streak. But I'm curious, how, if at all, you even think of that as a category anymore, because it feels to me as if it almost belongs to a moment in time that seems not quite accurate to say new formalists today. I feel like that's almost a generation or a generation and a half.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I never really liked the term to begin with because I
I don't
sort
know
of
that
felt
anybody does.
nobody does. I had a funny exchange for a while. I was maybe in the early 2000s or something. I was blogging on Harriet for a while. Poetry had kind of paid bloggers, and they would get these cohorts where they thought they would have interesting conversations. And I was put into a cohort where we were supposed to be poet critics, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, but one of our exchanges, and Angie Mlinko was in that cohort also. And one of the exchanges we had was like everyone like fights to be included under the term avant-garde, but nobody wants to be a new formalist. And we
Yeah.
talked about, clubs that you do or do not want to be in, and nobody wants to be in that club. And I think the sort of poetry wars or whatever of the 90s or early 2000s that were quite absurd and didn't make any sense, I think, to the British poetry world
Right,
where
right,
where rhyme and meter had never been put into this outer darkness, where
right. Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
this is just beyond the veil. And it was always kind of assumed that, you should be able to do that if you want to, just do it well. And then, in the States, we kind of had put it out into that outer darkness. So you had to either embrace that ironically or not ironically. I
Mhm.
don't know.
Yeah, yeah. It feels like there's like you don't get the righteous condemnation of it anymore, but you do get like an inept celebration of it. Like I feel like today there's it has become fashionable to say. I mean, even like I think Mataika has a series on celebrating form, but they are often my snotty observation is that it's often celebrations of form by people who don't seem quite to have a mastery of form.
I guess I haven't necessarily seen all of that. I haven't really kept up with those more recent developments. That sounds plausible. Sounds plausible to me.
Yeah, yeah, not yeah. You don't need to weigh in, but
I
yeah,
mean, I don't know. I mean, if anything, I think maybe like all of the MFAs and teaching of poetry has resulted in more people embracing certain kinds of form, whether that's, forms of repetition and so forth.
sure,
But
yeah, yeah.
so you see lots of that, I think, like pantoums and sestinas and things like that. I think rhyme is one of those things where people either handle it extremely well,
Right.
like extremely well. Like you take someone like Angie Mlinko or Richie Hoffman, who do amazing things. I hate, I need to quit using the word amazing, who do impressive things with rhymes, creatively and so forth. There was a poem of Richie Hoffman's that just came up on the site formerly known as Twitter that had these anagrammatical rhymes that just,
Oh,
I found fascinating.
I'm glad to
And
hear he's doing
we
because
both
he'd kind of abandoned meter and rhyme for a little bit. But I'm glad to hear he's because he was
well,
very good with it.
this is from an older book. I mean,
Okay,
but he's quite young. He can come
sure,
back
he
to
can do whatever he
this.
likes. But yeah, when he writes formally, he is quite good at that.
Yeah, and so I think there's this strand of people who may be somewhat descending from Merrill. I
Mm.
know Merrill is a big influence for Angie Mlinko, um, where they have this dazzling facility for rhyme. And then, there's sort of solid rhyming, and then there's abysmal rhyming. I don't know.
And one of the
And
one
the
of the
thing is,
different
it shows up. I mean, if you rhyme badly, it's very in your face or in your ear. So it's, whereas people who don't know what they're doing metrically, that often goes kind of under the radar.
it does seem to be that rhyme has returned, rhyme and repetition have returned, and meter have not. Meter is not quite caught on in the same way, or you see the typical, well, iambic pentameter equals 10 syllables, sort of treatment of meter. But there's an anecdote I have paraphrased of yours, which you can correct me
Uh-oh.
now
Uh-oh.
if I misremembered it, which was an encounter you had briefly with John Hollander, in which he gave a definition of doggerel that was more specific than I think it's generally used just to mean inept verse, but it is used. You cited him as using it to mean specifically rhyme without meter.
I guess that would be kind of scale tonic or whatever, but yeah, I think he it's a highly specific anecdote, but in this case, he was talking about rhyme with varying line lengths. So I
Okay,
guess more like Ogden Nashian
right,
kind of thing. I'm
uh,
not sure if he
or
was
Dover
talking.
Beach. Yeah.
Yeah, meter is another thing. I mean, I think the problem with meter, I mean, among the many problems, I say this a lot, is the Greek taxonomy doesn't map on well to what is happening in English. The truth of the matter is, I mean, even if you are reading reviews or analysis of poetry in places like the New Yorker, I actually keep clippings of this now. Places like the New Yorker, the New York Times, the TLS, whatever, you will have pretty big names in poetry, and they will scan a line, and I will just fall out of my chair. I mean, like, this person does not know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And it usually involves obscure feet. That's always a bad sign because, I'm
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
Occam's razor person, generally,
Yeah. Horses,
in
not
an iambic
zebras.
pentameter line, you're not going to run into a molossus. It's just not going to happen. It's not what's happening.
Yeah.
I have my own meter hobby horses, but I think a lot of people just don't understand it anymore. And all you have to do is read a few book reviews that try to analyze meter, and you just think, oh my gosh, this person does not know what they are talking about.
That was the first half of my conversation with A.E. Stallings. You can find the second half on The Secret Show at SLEERICKETS.substack.com. That will be up in the next day or so. Do send in your questions. I am still planning with Alice and Cameron and Brian to do some sort of big group Ask Us Anything episode. So please do send in your questions for all of us. We look forward to reading them and being forced to answer them on mic. Thank you all for listening. You can reach me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.